the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, pioneers of space and lion tamers of time, broken ramjets and token artificial intelligence. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. We have a roundtable discussion this time on the great new anthology of stories out from Baen, Space Pioneers. This is basically a collection of stories old and new about the exploration and colonization of space by humans, the ups and downs of a necessary push outward and upward. With us to discuss the book are the editors, Hank Davis and Christopher Ruocchio. Christopher also has a story in the anthology. And we also have with us the great James Gunn, legendary multiple award-winning science fiction author and scholar. And we also have the chief entrepreneur behind the space company Electric Sky, Jeff Greason. Jeff is the co-author with Sarah A. Hoyt of a story in the anthology that's set on the moon. So that's coming up. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. Now, here's the news. Ho, 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 we have some great free fiction and nonfiction at the Baen.com website for December. We put up a new story every month on the website that is often related to a book that's coming out the next month from Baen. Up now is Chancellor Wit by Susan R. Matthews. This is a story set in Susan's magnificent under-jurisdiction space opera series, starring reformed torturer Andrew Kosciuszko. This is a really fun story that is about the chief antagonist in Susan's upcoming novel, Crimes Against Humanity. He is a man who is a weird stalker sort of fan of Andrei Kosciuszko back in his torturing days, who's also in a position of power and working with some slavers in Gone Beyond Space. It's a really fun and twisty story from Susan. Now, we also have a nonfiction article for December. We continue with the fascinating series by Tom Kratman on the organization of war, both in real life and in Tom's Correia-verse, the Correia series of novels that he's written, where he has sort of played out thought experiments on his organizational ideas. The piece is called Principles of Organization for War and Organizing for War in the Correia-verse. This is part 3. Tom knows whereof he speaks. He's retired from a long career in the Army as a lieutenant colonel, and he had much to do with the infantry while he was doing that. So this is a knowledgeable and fun piece. And A Pillar of Fire by Night, Book 7 in Tom Kratman's hard-hitting Correia-verse series, is out right now at booksellers. And we continue with our serialization of Tom's essay on the philosophy behind the organization. Principles of Organization for War and Organizing for War in the Correia-verse Part 3 by Tom Kratman and Chancellor Wit by Susan R. Matthews are now available for free at Baen.com for your reading pleasure, and they will be perpetually available via Baen ebooks in the collection Free Stories 2018, and Tom's piece will likewise be available in Free Nonfiction 2018 ebook collection. What you do is you go to Baen.com and you can download them for free for your e-reader or computer, all formats, of course, as always. Fun stuff. Want to welcome James E. Gunn, the great James E. Gunn, Hank Davis, Christopher Ruocchio, Jeff Greason to the podcast. I didn't leave anybody out. No. Hello, everyone. Thanks for showing up today.
Good to be
Pleasure
here.
to be here.
Yeah.
Well, you came and got me, so
I did come and get you, Hank. So, well, let me give an introduction to everyone real quick, and then we'll dive in. James E. Gunn is a man of many hats: science fiction and fantasy writer, academic, editor, grand master of science fiction, which he won from SEFWA back in 2007. The actual award. A native Kansan from a family of editors and publishers, he served 3 years in the U.S. Navy during World War II, then took a B.S. at University of Kansas and an M.A. in English at Northwestern. Selling his first stories under the pseudonym of Edwin James, he has subsequently published nearly 100 stories, as well as writing 28 books, fiction and nonfiction, and editing 10 more. He's had a bunch of his stories made into various dramatic items. His novels began with Starbridge and This Fortress World, followed by The Joymakers, The Immortals, which became a TV movie and series, The Listeners, and more. His alternate worlds, The Illustrated History of Science Fiction, received a special award for the 1976 World SF Convention, Worldcon, and a 76 Locus Award. I think that's when he became Dr. Gunn, the distinguished historian of science fiction as well, out at the University of Kansas. His series of anthologies, The Road to Science Fiction, originally 6 volumes, now expanded to 8, combines classic stories with a running history of the field. He's past president of CEFWA, as well as being professor emeritus at the University of Kansas, where he's the director of the Center for the Study of Science Fiction. And in 2015, he was inducted into the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. Let me just go through everyone else real quick, and then we'll get on. Oh, by the way, Hank was mentioning, Jim, that one of your stories once was on the old Desilu.
Desilu, it's the one that's in the anthology.
That was in the anthology, was made into a. I guess we'll talk about that later. That's so though, right?
Yeah.
The Cave of Night.
Yeah, the Cave of
Which
Night
appeared there as Man in Space.
Well, I think the title was Man in Orbit, but it's been decades, so I could be wrong, sir. I did watch it at the time.
Well, let me move on to, while many SF authors write short stories and novels about space travel and space settlement, Jeff Greason is taking another path, opening the space frontier as an aerospace engineer, space entrepreneur, and commercial space consultant. Inspired by Star Trek, Robert Heinlein, and Jared O'Neill, Jeff has dedicated more than 20 years of his career to space technology development and making space travel available to civilians. He leapt from engineering next-generation computer processors at Intel to rocket engine development at Rotary Rocket. At the turn of the century, he co-founded and led X-Core Aerospace, an early commercial space transport firm that made history with dozens of manned rocket airplane flights. He helped Congress develop regulations to govern and foster the U.S. commercial human spaceflight industry and co-founded Commercial Space Federation Trade Association. He can currently be found innovating wireless power technology and beamed power propulsion and electric sky, and promoting smart investment in propulsion and energy technologies for solar system and interstellar flight as chairman of Tau Zero Foundation. Jeff is a popular speaker on space policy and commercial markets for space. Seems like he probably knows what he's talking about, and a Time Inventor of the Year. So we have a genuine space pioneer, and as well as being co-author with Sarah Hoyt of a story in the anthology. So welcome, Jeff. We also have along with us one of the young guns of science fiction, who's got a trilogy that he has, or whatever it is, a quadrology.
It's 4.
Sold to Daw Books, and as well as being assistant editor here with us at Baen. Christopher Ruocchio is the author of The Sun Eater, a space opera fantasy series from Daw, as well as the assistant editor here at Baen, where he has co-edited 2 anthologies, including this one we're talking about today. He's a graduate of North Carolina State University, where a penchant for self-destructive decision-making caused him to pursue a bachelor's in English rhetoric with a minor in classics. An avid student of history, philosophy, and religion, Christopher has been writing since he was 8, sold his first book, Empire of Silence, at 22, and he now lives in Raleigh, where he is often to be seen hunched over a keyboard. We also have Hank Davis here, who is editor emeritus here at Baen. Hank is also a really good science fiction writer of short stories, whose most famous story is probably the one that was in the Third Dangerous Visions anthology, and so we've never seen it. That was going to be the one that made your millions, right, Hank?
Oh, yeah.
Hank's a fantastic writer and an amazing editor, and he is sort of the brain trust of all things here at Baen.
I seem to have wasted most of my life reading science fiction.
And you've read all of it.
Oh yeah, I read a lot of stuff by James Gunn back in the 50s. I particularly liked The Little Orphan Android. Great title, by the way.
Well, let's talk about some of the stories. Let's talk first about parents. All right. So The Cave of Night is a wonderful story, and it's written before, I believe, I'm pretty sure, anybody went up in space. What was the atmosphere in which you wrote this, Jim?
Well, I had been inspired by a series of articles that appeared in Collier's beginning in 1952 and ending in early 1954 about the next steps in space that Werner von Braun had sort of organized, and it was illustrated by Chesley Bonestell's marvelous drawings. And for the first time, I think the impact of the possibility of advances in space flight had really come home to me. I mean, I'd been reading about it for years, but now it seemed to be imminent, and Bonestell's illustrations made it seem more possible. Actually, Willy Lay's book, The Conquest of Space, had appeared 3 years before with Bonestell's illustrations, and indeed they may have been used in the same issues. But I didn't see The Conquest of Space, I think, until some years later. But I was inspired by that series of articles to begin thinking seriously about how we might get into space, and I started writing, I think, The Cave of Night in 1954, and I got it published in 1955. Actually, I thought I would sell it maybe to Collier's or Saturday Evening Post, as I was really pleased with the way it came out. And my agent then, Fred Pohl, I think tried it on the Saturday Evening Post, got one rejection, and sent it over to Horace Gold at Galaxy. And shortly after that, it was broadcast over the radio program that was doing Galaxy stories called X-1. And about a year later, I was contacted by Horace, who said they were planning a television program like X-1 and wanted to take an option on The Cave of Night to inaugurate it. Didn't hear any more of it until I finally saw the announcement that had been sold to Desilu Playhouse, and it appeared in it was dramatized over X-1 as Man in Orbit in 1959, I'm sorry, with a good cast of H.G. Marshall and a number of other leading actors. But they changed my ending, so it had a difficult reaction from me. But my story is, well, I won't give the ending to it, but like many television and film productions, they have to have their own interpretation.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, we can't. The whole story. It's a trick story in a way, although it has a lot of feeling that nevertheless could work with leaving the ending off. But so I guess we can't.
Yeah, it really had a good reception.
This was X-1 was audio drama, right? It was a radio show.
Yeah, it was a radio show. It really did some marvelous work, I thought. They did dramatize 4 of my Galaxy stories on that over the series, and I thought did a great job of interpreting what was appearing in the pages without pretty faithfulness. In fact, they took a 1953 story, a novella of mine called Wherever You May Be, and condensed it in a half an hour with the commercials, and I thought managed to get the entire impact of the story there. It had wonderful writers like Ernest Correia and others.
Yeah, it's a great series, and it can be purchased and found various places on the web now.
Yeah, I think online you can actually listen to some of them.
Yeah, I recommend it if anybody likes to listen. The whole series, I think, is well worth listening to.
Yeah, I would also recommend the book, the sort of novel that grew out of The Cave of Night called Station in Space, which I thought was very good. You'll have to hunt the used bookstores for it. I don't think it's in print at the moment.
Yeah, Hank mentioned that. How did you cut down the different James Gunn stories that could possibly go into this anthology? How did you narrow it down to this one?
Actually, all four of the stories that make up Station in Space could have gone in. No, this one had a real impact on me. I missed it in Galaxy, but I read it when it was selected by Judith Merrill. She was doing one of the earliest best science fiction of the year series at the time, and I think the very first one had it in it. And I thought, wow, what a terrific story! And I read it. 7th grade or 8th grade or so, and it stayed with me all these years. So it really wasn't much cutting involved.
Yeah. So the basic setup of the story is that a guy gets launched into space, and he becomes like Timmy that fell into the well.
Or Floyd Collins, who probably isn't as well known now as he was in the 50s, got caught in a mine and couldn't get out.
Was there a precipitating story?
I might mention one follow-up to this. I was inspired in a way to continue this story with a series of stories which followed up on the first attempts for humanity to venture into space, with the notion that it might be necessary for some dramatic impact to get people energized to do it. And I followed it up with 4 more stories, which unfortunately Horace Gold turned down, were eventually published in other ventures, including the final story, which is a novella which appeared in Venture Science Fiction, and it was published as a collection, or actually I considered it a novel about the whole enterprise, and appeared from Badham Books in 1958, I believe, called Station in Space. Unfortunately, it was almost immediately after its publication, Sputnik went up and sort of reduced my whole argument into alternate history.
Isn't there a sense in which Sputnik's beep is sort of the same in a reduced way of, a guy is. It seems Sputnik always seemed like a really lonely satellite up there, lost forever, just beeping, and it could only transmit, right?
It was also that Sputnik was launched about a month after the Russians claimed to have launched an ICBM, which we had at the time. We were working on it. We had IRBMs, and we also had the Strategic Air Command, so we weren't really in that much danger. But they claimed to have launched an ICBM, and then about a month later they launched a satellite, which turned out, in retrospect, the satellite really wasn't that much, but they beat us to it.
Yeah,
was the main thing. Ours was much more sophisticated, which was one reason why the first 3 rockets blew up on the launching pad, or something like 3.
Was the general feeling, Jim, that it had to be a man or a person, a human, that got sent up, and that would be the first object in space?
Yes, but I think what really made the story work for me, and maybe for the readers, was the fact that once this man went up, he couldn't get back, and he had the ability to transmit, but he couldn't receive messages on his equipment. So we have this series of messages which came to Earth about his predicament, and the whole experience amounted to or inspired an effort to save him. And eventually, there's a moment in the story when he wants to know whether his messages have been received. And Kansas City turns its lights on and off at night as he passes over to give him a signal that he'd been received. And I thought it was interesting that when the first astronaut went around the Earth, American astronaut, that Perth, Australia turned its lights on and off as he passed over to signal his passage through her. I often wondered if they'd been inspired by my story or whether that was somebody independently thinking of it.
That's cool. Perth, I didn't know that Perth did that. Was there a general frustration at the time that space travel was taking too much, it was taking too long to happen?
Yeah,
something
at least among us science fiction fans and people, we felt that there needed to be something that catalyzed the potential of humanity to go off and conquer space. And my inspiration on that was to go back to some of the occasions when people have been lost, like the explorer in a cave in Kentucky and a girl named Kathy Fiskus who fell down a well in California, and the entire human focus was upon rescuing these people. And I thought that's the sort of thing we need to get people really committed to getting into space and doing what was necessary.
What do you think of development since then? Are we still in such a in such a state where a Timmy in the well kind of rescue would we'll just have basically the same story set on Mars in the Mars.
Yeah, well, I do think that what happened after we landed a man on the moon in 1969, and we sort of retreated at that point and started doing smaller things and things which didn't involve people until we put up that actually station in space. But it turned out to be largely an exercise in an experiment, which is fine, but did not capture the people's imagination. But I think in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been a sort of return to a general consensus that human exploration in space is necessary and inevitable, and we see a lot of effort being made by some very influential and wealthy people to try to accomplish that, including making a settlement on Mars, which may be impractical, but that was probably no more impractical than the first expeditions to the Western Hemisphere by Columbus and others.
Very true. Well, this would be a good opportunity to for me to segue over and talk to Jeff Greason, who actually is a space scientist as well as author. What do you think? What do you think about the current condition? We'll talk about your story momentarily, but how would you assess the current conditions of at least American culture as regards to getting us out there?
That's not a question that lends itself to an extremely succinct answer.
Understood. Yes.
Well, just from your perspective, how do you're happily working at this, right?
Yeah. I'm one of the post-Apollo generation. I don't remember a time before human spaceflight, but I'm a rather obsessive follower of the history of it. I think Apollo was a very anomalous event historically. It was perceived by many in the American society and in the world as the beginning of an opening of the space frontier, but it really wasn't that. It was really merely a geopolitical competition, and a lot of people, myself very much included, became very disappointed or disillusioned that wasn't followed up. But that's really not fair to the effort and what it accomplished. It wasn't intended to be the opening of a frontier, even if people hoped and believed that it was. And I think what you're starting to see now is a shift away from maybe if we just get everybody excited to do something like Apollo again, which I think is very unlikely, and instead a shift to what I think is a much firmer foundation of maybe if we start doing things in space that are economically valuable, that make money, we'll do a lot more of them.
So, Jeff, you're in Sarah's story. I assume that you provided some of the scientific foundation for this story. It's set on the moon. What kind of settlement is there on the moon?
This is a story that's set in a lava tube with, I don't think the exact number is given, but it was conceptualized as a roughly 30 to 50 person settlement. And Sarah came to me with a story and basically needed a plausible setting in which to put it. And I kind of did the world building and she told the story.
So how could we possibly settle on the moon and have a settlement like this? And would there be children born there? And tell us about this place.
Okay. Well, as to how we can settle on the moon or on Mars or elsewhere in the solar system, the challenge will be, as it has been in all past settlements in history, finding reasons to go. The technological challenges of it really are less daunting than the economic and what I call business case challenges of it. But as far as the moon is concerned, it's certainly becoming more and more plausible that now that we know that there is ice on the poles, and probably in subsurface caves as there are in ice caves on the Earth. Although that second is speculative, it seems likely from the nature of the polar traps and the cold traps that are trapping the volatiles on the moon. It's been suggested, although we didn't go into this in the story, that will be an economic driver for some expanded activity and some industrial activity on the lunar surface. Lava tubes are there. We can see the collapsed ones, rills. We can see some smaller ones where a subsidence or an impact crater has broken through to the lava tube below. So large lava tubes on the moon are not speculative. Judging from the sizes of the rills that we see, they get quite large. It's been worked out by geologists that a lunar lava tube could be about 1 kilometer in diameter before it would collapse, which is certainly much, much larger than any structure we're likely to be building there anytime soon, which is why a lot of people, myself included, think that they make a natural early potential habitat because it's a radiation shielded structure that's already there.
Well, are they airtight in any sense, or would you have to do that?
If you drill into them or use a skylight, then they're not airtight. You'd have to seal them off. Although even if you put individual structures in them, the story we said is on one that was sealed off. But even if you just put individual structures in them, although it's not often depicted in science fiction, long-term habitation on the moon does require a fair bit of radiation shielding. And it would be useful just to put yourself under the roof, so to speak, just to get the radiation shielding, whether you did or didn't use it as a large pressurized volume.
So do you think that living on the moon is going to be mostly underground?
I think living on the moon is going to be mostly under dirt, whether that's because you're underground or whether that's because you put dirt, which, the science types call regolith, on the surface of the moon over your habitat as additional radiation shielding. But you do need, if you're going to live there for real and not just visit, and live there and have kids and raise your families, you need about 2 or 3 meters of equivalent shielding of dirt or rock over your head just to reproduce the cosmic ray shielding that we get here on Earth from the atmosphere.
So what about having kids? You have the children in the story. They undergo a centrifuge. Is that just so that they can maybe visit their grandparents back on Earth, or is there another purpose?
Well, that's in part there for story purposes, but okay, it's kind of one of the great frustrations, but I suppose from the author's point of view, it's great because we know so little that anything that you say about the effects of gravitation on long-term health are speculative. All we really know about gravitational biology is that a long time in 0G is bad. And of course, we are used to being in 1G. But a lot of things that people have speculated about over the years, is 1/6G like you have on the moon, is that going to have long-term health effects? Is 1/3G like we have on Mars going to have long-term health effects? We don't know. We're 50 plus years into the space age, 60 years into the space age almost now. And to this day, no complex organism has ever been raised to maturity in a centrifuge in space. The only centrifuge data we have on levels between 0 and 1G are a handful of very short Russian satellite flights, some sounding rocket flights, and we've centrifuged some single-celled organisms on the space station and observed their development in biology. So there's a lot of contradictory data, but very low quality. I would give almost anything to get the experiment done where we raise some mice or some rats on the centrifuge that they now have on the ISS at G levels in between 0 and 1, so we can find out what the long-term health effects are on a mammal and being in those environments. Today, we just don't.
What? Tell us a little bit about your day job, is it really going to be possible to use I think the idea is large energy beams like lasers to vaporize a small amount of mass and propel something into the sky and get it out of the gravity well.
It is possible. But that's not what we're doing. I can't say very much about what we're doing other than to say that we have the great challenge is how to transmit energy in a form where if you accidentally got something in the way, you wouldn't hurt it. But certainly other researchers have done the kind of experiments you're talking about where you use microwave beams or millimeter wave beams or laser beams. So far those have only gone a couple hundred feet in the air because of the limitations of the small scale of the beam sources that have been used. But it absolutely is a possible thing to do. The question is, can it be made an economic thing to do? And that's what I'm working on.
I suppose you also have something to do with the idea of beaming, collecting satellites energy back down to Earth.
I personally don't. I'm very aware of the field. I know a lot of the people who are working in it. Again, that's completely technically possible, has been for a long time, and the ideas for how we might do that are getting better and better. Personally, I'm an engineer and an entrepreneur, so I ask, when's it going to make money? When it makes money, we'll do it. And the challenge with solar power right now is we're producing solar cells now that they are cheap enough to be competitive. We're essentially making them as fast as we can, and we're building new factories as fast as we can. Right now, if you have another solar cell, you're not short of deserts to put it in. Now, as solar becomes a bigger and bigger part of the Earth's energy mix, there'll come a time when power in the nighttime becomes more expensive than power in the daytime. And when that happens, putting the solar cells in space so that they don't have a nighttime up there will become very attractive.
Where are we? What is the cool interface between technology and making money right now? That I know you not to ask you to violate any NDAs or whatever, or your own.
No, but the industry as a whole is making some very interesting progress. I think it's the two major developments of the last 10 or 15 years that are coming together is that we finally have moved space transportation fully into the private sector. All commercial and military satellites are now launched on private vehicles in the United States. And thanks to some new entrants, there's now, there are more than two, but there are two large entrants in the United States market who are the majority players in the market for space transportation, SpaceX and United Launch Alliance. And, what's happening is for the first time ever, space transportation now has a price. It may be a high price, but it's a price. You can, you can go in and ask how much is it going to take to launch something, and you get a number back. As recently as 5 years ago, the answer was, well, when you got your money together, come and we'll negotiate something, which made starting a company to use space transportation a very challenging effort. Now it's a lot easier. In the same time, mostly because of the proliferation of more modern electronics, smaller satellites have become more and more capable. And what's been interesting about that is that because there are smaller, you tend to make more of them for doing a given mission, what we call a constellation, a group of satellites that orbit the Earth to do a thing. And that's led to the emergence of catalog items. There are actually, you can build a satellite out of a catalog now. You can buy the specialty receivers and the navigational instruments and the radios and the solar cells and the antennas and the gyros and everything else literally out of catalogs, which makes it tremendously easier for new entrepreneurs to build new kinds of satellite applications. There's a bewildering array of new companies that are all standing up efforts to build new services and satellites using that kinds of technology.
So it sounds like just the marketplace itself is the big thing at the moment that is cool and new and real.
Yeah, it's hard for people, even myself, who've been in the entrepreneurial world for 20 years. It's a little hard to break away from the Apollo-like vocabulary of talking about, the space program, the space effort, space exploration. But exploration is an activity which human beings have found to be useful for as long as they've been around, in part because we do more than just explore, come back and say, that was neat. After the explorers go, come the pioneers, come the miners, come the foresters and the hunters and the trappers and the builders and the traders and all of the other things that civilization brings with it. And, I think a challenge that we have faced has been that the exploration phase of space has gone on a little long, and the exploitation or use or settlement phase, or the industrialization, if you prefer, phase, has lagged somewhat behind. Now that that's catching up, I think we're going to find those are mutually reinforcing activities. If space transportation to orbit is paid for commercially and is a profit-making venture, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier for both government and private activities to go beyond, because they can build on the industrial base that's already there and already making money commercially.
Well, let me ask you maybe a final question on this. If you could go and live on the moon in the habitat that you described, you and Sarah created in Homefront, the story, would you go?
No question, like a shot.
So maybe some of that old that old saying Freud is still hanging behind everything that you entrepreneurs are up to. The little boy is still there somewhere.
At the risk of speaking out of turn, I know most of the principals at other space transportation efforts, and I don't think I'm the only one who, well, you look at the other names out there who are better known in building these ships. We're all frustrated children of Apollo. We're all building the ride because nobody would sell us one.
That's cool. Well, let me move on to Christopher, and we'll talk about his story for a moment, and then maybe wrap up after that. So, Christopher, you have the far future story in the anthology. Is this set within the world of your Sun Eater?
Yeah, it is. It's about 3,000 years before the book and completely unrelated. So you don't have to. You don't have to do your homework before you read it. But I already had the world building done, and I figured the story was sort of sprung on me as I was co-editing with Hank. He asked if I wanted to write one to put it in there. So I figured, well, I have this setting. I may as well run with it.
Is you have sort of a ghost story of sorts, intergalactic ghost story or interstellar ghost story. Tell us about these ghoulies that scare children in this future.
Yeah, so in the story, it's several, so 10,000 plus years in the future, and there are people who just never came back down. They, in order to get away from this sort of imperial government that runs a lot of the planets, they have, like all rebels and outcasts and everywhere, have started hiding from the law. They live in these huge spaceships, and that has its advantages. They get to do whatever they get to live according to their own philosophy. But it has their disadvantages. They are living in space, and Mr. Greason alluded to having to hide underground when you're on a world like the Moon that has no magnetic sphere to escape radiation. These ships are shielded, but it being a space opera, but they aren't safe enough. And so these people who live on these ships have over time adapted to this by replacing a lot of themselves with machines, and as time goes on they lose crew members, and so the villains in this story are trying to find a way to replace their lost members by well, I don't know if I should give the twist away, but by shanghaiing some people. And my main character is a repo man who is trying to get them back.
It's interesting that you posit that a lot of the same. Your guy's a rough character who's not exactly morally neutral, but it's interesting that some of the morality in the future in Parliament of Owls, the name of your story, is still. We still feel this need to protect our own. Do you think that there's something that will remain even after we've remade ourselves and gone to the stars?
Well, I hope so. I hope there's always something recognizably human about us, and that informed a good deal of the world building for the series overall, and there's some of it implicit in the story. The Empire that I referred to has, like in Frank Herbert's Dune, they're very anti-technological in terms of artificial intelligence and modifying people. And so the humans there, at least, and the main character, Callus, is from the Empire, are still very human in terms of what they look like and how they act and in how they think. We can connect with them. Just because I think a story that doesn't have that humanity loses something. It's harder to connect to. We see some space opera, it's just a whole bunch of hyper-intelligent machine ships or these strange aliens, and they don't think in ways that we necessarily relate to. And those stories are great, but they don't speak to the human condition as well, I think. And they aren't trying to, but I wanted to. And so, despite, like you say, Callus is kind of a rough character. He was a soldier. Some of his morality doesn't quite map onto our 21st century sensibilities, but there are things about it that are maybe more historical. I'm a bit of like you mentioned earlier, I'm a bit of a classicist, so there's some things in terms of what's valuable to him that might be more recognizably medieval or even Roman in terms of his moral code. He doesn't blink that much about killing people, but the transhuman sort of enemy that he is pitted against violates his sense of right and wrong on a pretty profound level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it makes for a really cool a cool story. We don't want to actually go into it too. I'm sure we'll give away the MacGuffin.
Anyone who's a Philip Marlowe fan ought to dash to the bookstore and read this and pay for the book.
Definitely. He has a definite continental op feel to him.
Well, I was sort of jealous. Larry Correia had his noir science fiction anthology they were doing, and I thought it would be kind of fun to write a noir story. So this has sort of a Philip Marlowe feel to it, just because I always liked that sort of.
I like noir detective crossed with science fiction as a genre. Probably James Gunn probably has an entire chapter or two about it somewhere. So this one's a great example of that, and it's really fun. I think we are just about out of time, actually, and I want to thank everyone for phoning in. Hank, do you have anything you want to say to wrap up about the anthology? This is you don't see a whole lot of hopeful science fiction anthologies these days.
And I think the stories are hopeful. They may have bad things happening to the characters, but the exploration goes on. I mean, just because Columbus ended up in jail didn't put an end to the new world being explored. But I would like to say thanks to all the writers who are still living. I'm glad that Dr. Gunn is one who let me use their stories. Although, of course, things being how they are, the majority of the writers are no longer with us, but they left their mark.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed putting this one together. I'd like to do another one, so I hope all you people out there will buy this. And maybe Tony Weisskopf will let me do a sequel. Son of Space Pioneers.
Son of Space Pioneers.
Or Daughter of Space Pioneers.
The Sons of the Space Pioneers. Well, so it is a wonderful anthology, and I will say that I have a story in here myself, a reprint of a story I wrote for Asimov's back in the 90s. Called In From the Commons. So if for no other reason, buy it for my story, even though James Gunn is in there. And Paul Anderson and Robert Heinlein. So, and we got a Larry Niven.
Yes, your story has quite a twist, too.
Yeah, I do have a twist story in there as well.
So yeah, I do want to say I've really been enjoying reading it. You've managed to find, some I'm a pretty active reader of the old classic science fiction, but there's a lot of stuff in here by well-known authors that I hadn't had a chance to see before, so I've been enjoying the heck out of it.
It seems like this is an example of the continuing discussion that science fiction writers have been engaged in for many years on the human species and how it got to be where it is and where it may be going.
Oh, thank you.
There are few people like Hank Davis in this world who have the breadth and the, maybe James Gunn is the only other one that have the breadth and the depth to put together something so cool. The book is Space Pioneers, edited by Hank Davis and Christopher Ruocchio. It is out now at booksellers everywhere. It's full of wonderful, great short stories. Everybody go grab it. And I want to thank...
Yes, and you get 550 pages.
That's right. It's quite thick.
They're only $7.98. Bargain.
Yeah. I want to thank Hank Davis, Christopher Ruocchio, and Jeff Greason, and the great James Gunn, the legendary James Gunn, for being with us. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
They were all here for different reasons. Politicians, warriors, wealthy bankers, even wizards. But the important thing was that they were all useful and connected. Today I bring fantastic news and a wonderful opportunity before you. After today's reading of the offense, you are all aware of the situation in the north, but you may not comprehend the dire situation in the south. He nodded at one of the masked men to proceed. The conspirator was from the affected house. The rebellion is far worse than what has been reported before the committee. This prophet has inspired many to join their cause, and as a result, he's built a small army of religious fanatics who've been waging war against House Akershan. They've destroyed multiple settlements, disrupted trade routes, and sabotaged many of the iron mines. There's no doubt that this is the costliest rebellion any house has experienced in generations. Most of the Cabal took some sick pleasure at that news. They may have been united in their desire for power, but everyone retained some bias in favor of the house he'd been born into, so it was natural to delight in the suffering of another. It was poor Akershan that was burning, instead of their ancestral holdings. So that was a cause for rejoicing. Though they were all in disguise, it was easy to pick out the warrior caste among them from their sheer physical presence. The courtly types looked frail in comparison. One of his warriors spoke. To be fair to our southern brethren, from examining the tactics of the rebels, I believe that some members of the higher castes have joined with them and are providing training and logistical support. This is no mere casteless mob. Impossible, said another. They're certainly not fighting like fish-eaters, said his southern spy. His real name was Farrell, and it was his family holdings that were being torched. Their leadership is hiding in the mountains, and we've not been able to root them out. Someone has been supplying them with illegal magic. And there have even been indications that they've been in contact with Fortress. A warrior swore. If only we could get an army across the sea without being torn apart by demons, we'd destroy those lunatics once and for all. Amand watched their reactions carefully. Fortress had earned its name by being unassailable. The island was tantalizingly close to the mainland. The strip of ocean separating them was so narrow in a few places that, in the coldest years, a brave man could walk across the shifting ice floes. Over the centuries, different houses had tried to send armies across, but any activity on the ice inevitably attracted swarms of demons. Small groups had made it to the island, only to perish against the great stone walls, as the fanatics rained fire and thunder down on them. As much as it galled the bureaucracy to have anyone not bend their knee to the law, after many fruitless sieges and thousands of dead warriors, most of the first caste liked to pretend that the island of fanatics didn't exist at all. It has been years since an army has tried to cross the channel, Archer said. The fanatics cross somehow, Farrell spat. Doubtful, said a northern judge. That's nothing but rumors southern houses use to excuse their inability to keep their untouchables in line. More likely it's their lax standards of discipline stirring up trouble than witches from Fortress. The man put an end to that myth before his meeting degenerated into prideful house bickering. It is extremely rare, but such crossings have been documented before. No one, not even the best minds of the Inquisition, had been able to figure out how they snuck across, even during warm years. Theories ranged from magical flying devices to secret tunnels beneath the ocean floor. Recently, some of our soldiers have been killed by Fortress-forged weapons, so either they're smuggling things across, or worse, someone has taught the rebels how to recreate their alchemy here. Farrell paused to let that sink in. Now that was serious. No house wanted that madness spreading to their lands. The warrior caste was especially terrified of weapons which could make the lowest among them equals in battle to someone who'd spent his whole life training. The rebels refuse to fight unless they have overwhelming numbers, and when they don't, they simply flee and blend back into the casteless slums to hide. Normally, the rebellious would be given up by the other non-people with a few bribes or threats, but this prophet keeps the masses silent. Through fear or adoration, we don't know. Purging entire casteless quarters has only caused more to join his army. Protectors have been slaughtering the rebels stupid enough to stand and fight, but they can't find this prophet either, supplied another conspirator. As the warriors were easy to spot, so were the courtiers of the first caste, with their smooth inflection, fine clothing, and skin that never saw direct sunlight because there was always a slave there holding an umbrella. He addressed Ormond directly. "Even the witch hunters you've dispatched haven't been able to catch him. That's because I've ordered them to look in the wrong place," Ormond explained patiently. That announcement caused quite a stir. "Calm down. I've had Inquisition spies hidden among the Prophet's followers for quite some time." There seemed to be some confusion at that, and the southern members were aghast. Of course, with their homelands being ravaged by savages, an emotional response had been expected, but that was just part of the game. It was good to occasionally remind the other conspirators that he knew more than they did. "I've spared their prophet's life because a competent foe is actually a good thing for us right now. If our plans are to succeed, we'd need a villain eventually, and all these years I'd thought we'd have to manufacture one for the houses to unite against when the time came." Ormond raised his hands theatrically towards the heavens and spoke like the actors did when portraying a religious fanatic in a play. "But the gods will provide." "But what about my property?" Farrell demanded. "My family is—" "Your sacrifice has been noted. After we've consolidated power, you will be rewarded. And just because a little bribery now was more certain than the promise of great bribes later," Ormond added, "in the meantime, I will see to it that you are compensated for your material losses." "So you think this is the crisis we've been waiting for?" Atria asked. "It is a fine start, but sadly, no. We need something better. Every few generations, some delusional casteless who can manage to string a few coherent sentences together gets them all riled up with talk of the forgotten and tales of make-believe. A false prophet is hardly a unique threat. In time, this rebellion would be crushed like all that have come before, and things will return to the way they've always been. The houses will go back to squabbling, never-ending competition over scraps, while the capital bloviates and guides with a lenient hand, and we will remain a nation in name only." Farrell spoke. "We all know such stagnation stands in the way of progress. For society to improve, the capital must assume greater central control. With us in charge." Well, that went without saying. "But if a mass casteless rebellion isn't enough to force the houses to give up their autonomy, what is?" "Something truly epic. A threat so vile that even the most independent Thakor will beg for the capital's help." Ormond was rather proud of his idea. It was rare that such a wonderful intersection of opportunity and good fortune arose. It would be a crime not to take advantage of it. That, my friends, is where our fallen protector and his legendary sword come into play. "He's so devoted to the law that he's voluntarily rotting in a Vidal prison," said a courtier. "We all heard the offended's asinine complaint today, but what does black-hearted Ashok have to do with an uprising in the south?" "Nothing. Yet."
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast, thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Also thanks to Christopher Ruocchio for organizational help in getting the interview together this time, and a rousing huzzah and hullabaloo, plus thanks plaudits, and an electric sky filled with zooming ships and raining dollars. For Hank Davis, Christopher Ruocchio, Jeff Greason, and James E. Gunn, editors and authors of Space Pioneers. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.